In the spring of 1945, German women POWs stepped off a train in Louisiana and froze in terror, not at guns or chains, but at the sheer size of the American soldiers guarding them, towering giants who looked nothing like the weak, decadent enemy described in Nazi propaganda. Within days, these women would experience something even more shocking than their captors' physical strength, a level of abundance, kindness, and industrial power that would shatter everything they'd been taught to believe about the war. But here's what no one tells you. What did these women say when they finally returned home to a starving, devastated Germany, and could they ever admit the truth about what they had seen? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the spring of 1945, Germany was dying. The war that Adolf Hitler promised would last 1,000 years was collapsing after only 12. Every day, Allied bombs fell from the sky and turned German cities into mountains of broken stone and twisted metal. Factories that once built tanks and planes now sat silent and empty. The railways that carried soldiers to battle were blown apart. Food was so scarce that German families stood in long lines for hours just to get a single loaf of bread made from sawdust and potato peels. Children had hollow cheeks and thin arms because they only ate 1,000 calories each day, barely enough to stay alive. Mothers boiled grass and tree bark to make soup. Tuberculosis spread through the cities like wildfire because no one had enough strength to fight off disease. The Nazi government had told the German people for 12 years that they were the master race, superior to all others on earth. They said that Germans were tall and strong and pure, destined to rule the world. They said that Americans were weak and lazy, corrupted by jazz music and mixed races, a nation of shopkeepers who cared only about money and comfort. The propaganda posters showed American soldiers as fat and cowardly, unable to fight real warriors. German children learned in school that American men were soft because they had never known real struggle or sacrifice. The women who served in the German military believed these lies with all their hearts because they had heard nothing else since they were young girls. Gertrude was 23 years old and had worked as a telephone operator for the Wehrmacht, connecting calls between officers across the front lines. Ilse was 28 and had served in a Luftwaffe anti-aircraft battery, watching the sky for enemy planes and firing massive guns at the bombers that came every night. Annalisa was only 19 and had worked as a nurse's aide, bandaging wounded soldiers and holding their hands as they died. All three women wore the gray-green uniforms of the German military and had sworn an oath to fight for the fatherland until their last breath. They believed they were serving something noble and pure, defending their homeland from enemies who wanted to destroy their way of life. But by the spring of 1945, they were prisoners. Gertrude had been captured by American forces in France when her communications post was overrun. Ilse had been taken prisoner after the D-Day invasion when her battery ran out of ammunition and the American tanks rolled right over their position. Annalisa had been captured during the Battle of the Bulge when the field hospital where she worked was surrounded. Now, all three women sat in the back of a dark freight train, rattling across an ocean they had crossed on a prisoner ship, heading to a place called Louisiana that they had never heard of before. The train car smelled like sweat and fear. 30 women sat on wooden benches, pressed together in the heat. Some cried quietly, others stared at nothing. They were exhausted and terrified because they did not know what would happen to them. They had heard stories about what happened to prisoners of war. Some said the Americans would work them to death in factories. Others whispered that they would be tortured for information or left to starve in cages. Gertrude looked down at her hands and saw how thin they had become. Her uniform hung loose on her shoulders. Before the war, she had weighed 130 pounds. Now she weighed maybe 95. All the women looked the same, with sunken eyes and bones showing through their skin. The train began to slow down. The women tensed and grabbed each other's hands. Through the wooden slats of the freight car, they could see pine trees and red dirt and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The air was thick and hot and smelled like flowers, nothing like the cold spring air of Germany. The train squealed to a stop, and the door slid open with a bang that made everyone jump. Sunlight poured into the dark car and blinded them for a moment. Then their eyes adjusted and they saw the platform. Standing there in two neat rows were American soldiers, military police wearing clean uniforms with white helmets and white belts. And the women froze because they could not believe what they were seeing. The Americans were enormous. They stood like giants, easily 6 feet tall or more, with broad shoulders and thick arms and chests like barrels. Their uniforms fit perfectly across muscular bodies. Their faces were clean-shaven and healthy, with clear skin and bright eyes. Their boots were polished to a mirror shine. They looked like they had been carved from stone, like statues of ancient gods come to life. Gertrude felt her breath catch in her throat. She had never seen men this large or this strong in her entire life. The average German soldier she had known stood maybe 5'7" or 5'8", and by 1944, most of them were sick and hungry and tired. These American soldiers looked like they could pick up a German soldier with one hand and toss him aside like a doll. Ilse grabbed Gertrude's arm and whispered in German, her voice shaking. "Mein Gott, they are giants! How can this be? We were told they were weak." Anneliese could not speak at all. She just stared with her mouth open, her mind trying to understand what her eyes were seeing. These could not be the same Americans from the propaganda posters, the soft and lazy men who cared only about movies and music. These men looked like they had never missed a meal in their lives, like they had been fed on milk and meat and bread every single day since they were born. One of the American MPs stepped forward and said something in English that none of the women understood. His voice was deep and calm. He did not yell or point a weapon. He just gestured for them to come down from the train car. Slowly, the women climbed down onto the platform, their legs weak and shaking. They stood in a group, dirty and thin and afraid, surrounded by these massive soldiers who towered over them like trees. And in that moment, standing in the Louisiana heat under a bright American sky, Gertrude felt the first crack appear in everything she had ever believed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The women were led through a gate made of chain-link fence topped with barbed wire into a place called Camp Ruston. Long wooden buildings painted white stretched in neat rows across flat ground covered in grass. Everything looked clean and organized, nothing like the bombed-out chaos they had left behind in Germany. American flags hung from tall poles and moved gently in the warm breeze. The women walked in a line, their eyes darting everywhere, trying to understand this strange new world they had entered. After being processed and given numbers and having their names written in big ledgers, the women were taken to a building that smelled like food, real food, not the thin cabbage soup or moldy bread they had eaten for years. Gertrude felt her stomach clench with hunger so powerful it made her dizzy. They walked into a huge room filled with long tables and benches. This was the mess hall. American soldiers sat at some of the tables, eating and talking and laughing like they had not a care in the world. The women were directed to a line where other prisoners of war were waiting with metal trays. A man in a white apron stood behind a long counter. He was a black American soldier, which shocked the women because Nazi propaganda had taught them that black people were inferior and lived like slaves in America. But this man looked healthy and strong and wore a clean uniform under his apron. He smiled at them and said something in English they could not understand, then began putting food on their trays. Gertrude watched as a piece of roasted chicken appeared on her tray, the skin golden brown and glistening with fat. Then a huge scoop of mashed potatoes, white and fluffy with a pat of yellow butter melting on top. Then green beans that actually looked green, not gray like the vegetables in Germany. Then a thick slice of white bread, soft and fresh. Then a cup of coffee, real coffee that smelled rich and dark. And finally, a slice of apple pie with a dollop of cream on top. The women were led through a gate made of chain-link fence topped with barbed wire into a place called Camp Rustin. Long wooden buildings painted white stretched in neat rows across flat ground covered in grass. Everything looked clean and organized, nothing like the bombed-out chaos they had left behind in Germany. American flags hung from tall poles and moved gently in the warm breeze. The women walked in a line, their eyes darting everywhere, trying to understand this strange new world they had entered. After being processed and given numbers and having their names written in big ledgers, the women were taken to a building that smelled like food. Real food, not the thin cabbage soup or moldy bread they had eaten for years. Gertrude felt her stomach clench with hunger so powerful it made her dizzy. They walked into a huge room filled with long tables and benches. This was the mess hall. American soldiers sat at some of the tables, eating and talking and laughing like they had not a care in the world. The women were directed to a line where other prisoners of war were waiting with metal trays. A man in a white apron stood behind a long counter. He was a black American soldier, which shocked the women because Nazi propaganda had taught them that black people were inferior and lived like slaves in America. But this man looked healthy and strong, and he wore a clean uniform under his apron. He smiled at them and said something in English they could not understand, then began putting food on their trays. Gertrude watched as a piece of roasted chicken appeared on her tray, the skin golden brown and glistening with fat. Then a huge scoop of mashed potatoes, white and fluffy with a pat of yellow butter melting on top. Then green beans that actually looked green, not gray like the vegetables in Germany. Then a thick slice of white bread, soft and fresh. Then a cup of coffee, real coffee that smelled rich and dark. And finally, a slice of apple pie with a dollop of cream on top. Ilse stood frozen, staring at her tray. Tears began running down her face. She could not move her feet. An American guard gently touched her shoulder and pointed to the tables, encouraging her to sit. The three women found seats together and just looked at their food for a long moment. Anneliese whispered, "Is this real? Is this some kind of trick? Are they going to take it away?" Gertrude shook her head slowly. "I do not know. I do not understand any of this." When they finally began to eat, the food tasted like something from a dream they had forgotten. The chicken was tender and juicy. The potatoes were creamy and rich. The bread was soft and sweet. Gertrude had not tasted butter in 3 years. She had not seen white bread since before the war started. In Germany, they made bread from sawdust and ground acorns because there was no wheat. Here, prisoners ate bread made from real flour, bread so soft it melted in your mouth. Ilse ate slowly, afraid she might vomit because her stomach had shrunk so small. Anneliese could not stop crying as she ate, thinking of her little brothers back home who were probably starving at that very moment. After the meal, Ilse dared to ask a question to one of the guards who spoke a little German. She pointed at the food and asked if this was a special meal, maybe before they would be questioned or punished. The guard looked confused, then laughed and shook his head. "No, ma'am," he said in broken German. "Regular food, every day, 3 times." Ilse felt the world tilt sideways. Every day, 3 meals like this. Every single day. It was impossible. Germany could not feed its soldiers even 1 meal like this per week. How could America feed thousands of prisoners this way every single day? 2 days later, the women were sitting outside their barracks in the shade when they heard a truck engine. A large green military truck pulled up near the mess hall, and American soldiers jumped out and began unloading wooden crates. Anneliese watched as the soldiers opened the crates and began pulling out glass bottles filled with dark brown liquid. She recognized the shape from propaganda posters that mocked American culture. Coca-Cola! The soldiers were laughing and joking as they loaded the bottles into a big metal box filled with ice. Ice in the middle of spring. Ice just to keep soda cold. One of the soldiers, a young man with red hair and freckles, noticed the women watching. He walked over carrying 2 bottles of Coca-Cola, already opened, with condensation dripping down the glass. He held them out and said something in English with a big smile. When the women hesitated, he made a drinking motion and nodded encouragingly. Annalise slowly reached out and took one of the bottles. It was so cold it almost hurt her hand. She lifted it to her lips and took a small sip. The taste exploded in her mouth. Sweet and fizzy and cold, like nothing she had ever experienced. The bubbles tickled her nose and made her cough a little. The soldier laughed, not meanly, just amused, and patted her shoulder before walking away. Annalise stood there holding the bottle and watching as the soldiers casually drank their Coca-Colas and then tossed the empty bottles into a bin like they were nothing. Like these precious bottles of sugar water were so common they could just throw them away. In Germany, people were drinking water from bomb craters because the wells had been destroyed. Children licked rocks for salt. And here, American soldiers drank cold sugar water from glass bottles and threw them in the trash. She looked at Gertrude and said quietly, "If this is what they give to prisoners, what do their own people have?" The next week, Gertrude was assigned to work in the camp kitchen. She reported early in the morning and walked through a back door into the largest kitchen she had ever seen. It was like a cathedral made of stainless steel and white tile. Huge stoves lined one wall, each one big enough to cook food for 100 people. Giant pots hung from hooks on the ceiling. Industrial ovens stood in rows, their doors large enough to walk through. And then she saw the refrigerator room, a heavy metal door with a handle. An American cook opened it and gestured for her to look inside. Cold air rushed out and made her shiver. Inside was a room as big as her family's entire house back in Bavaria, and it was filled with food. Sides of beef hung from hooks. Crates of eggs were stacked 6 feet high. Wheels of cheese the size of wagon wheels sat on shelves. Boxes of butter. Sacks of flour and sugar piled to the ceiling. Cans of vegetables in towers that seemed to touch the sky. Gertrude felt her knees go weak. The American cook, a sergeant with gray hair, noticed her reaction. He spoke slowly in simple English and used his hands to help her understand. He pointed around the kitchen and held up all his fingers twice. 5,000, he said. 5,000 prisoners. We feed. Every day. Then he swept his arm in a big circle. Many camps, hundreds, all over America. Gertrude did the math in her head. 5,000 prisoners at this one camp. Hundreds of camps across America. All of them feeding prisoners 3 full meals every day. The logistics alone would crush Germany's entire supply system. The trains, the trucks, the warehouses, the farms needed to produce this much food. Germany could never do this. Germany could not even feed its own soldiers properly, and they were supposed to be the priority. That night in the barracks, the women whispered to each other in the dark. Sleep did not come easily because their minds were full of questions that had no good answers. Ilse said, "The Führer told us America was weak and divided, that they could barely organize themselves, that they were soft from too much luxury. But look at what we have seen. This is not weakness. This is power beyond anything we imagined." Annalise added, "If they treat their prisoners this well, with real food and medicine and clean beds, what do their soldiers have? What do their families have?" Gertrude stared at the wooden ceiling and said what they were all thinking but afraid to speak aloud. Everything we were told was a lie. The months passed slowly at Camp Rustin. Summer turned to fall, and the heat finally broke into cooler air that reminded the women of home. By November of 1945, the war in Europe had been over for 6 months. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. The women knew they would eventually go home, but the American government was still organizing the massive job of sending hundreds of thousands of prisoners back across the ocean. So they waited and worked and tried not to think too much about what they would find when they finally returned to the rubble of their homeland. Then came the announcement that changed everything. The Americans were going to celebrate something called Thanksgiving, and all the prisoners would be included in the feast. The women did not understand what Thanksgiving was, but the other prisoners who had been in the camp longer explained it. Thanksgiving was an American holiday where families gathered to eat a huge meal and give thanks for their blessings. It happened every year on the fourth Thursday of November. The women could not imagine why the Americans would include prisoners in their family holiday, but they were told to report to the mess hall on Thursday afternoon. When Annalise walked into the mess hall that Thanksgiving Day, she stopped so suddenly that the woman behind her bumped into her back. The room had been transformed. Paper decorations hung from the ceiling, turkeys and leaves and cornucopias cut from colored paper. The tables were covered with white cloths instead of being bare wood. Small American flags stood in jars at the center of each table. Music played from a radio in the corner, cheerful and bouncing. American soldiers were already sitting at the tables, not in separate areas, but mixed right in with the prisoners, laughing and talking like they were all at the same party. The food line moved slowly because there was so much to serve. A whole roasted turkey, golden brown and the size of a small child, sat on the counter. A cook carved off thick slices of white and dark meat and laid them on each tray. Then came stuffing made with bread and herbs and celery. Then sweet potatoes mashed with butter and brown sugar and topped with toasted marshmallows. Then regular mashed potatoes with gravy. Then corn on the cob, each ear as long as her forearm and dripping with butter. Then cranberry sauce, dark red and sweet. Then rolls, soft and warm, with more butter. Then a slice of pumpkin pie topped with whipped cream. And finally, a small bowl of vanilla ice cream, because the Americans said you needed ice cream with your pie. Annalise carried her tray to a table and sat down. Across from her sat an American sergeant who smiled and said, "Happy Thanksgiving, ma'am. Eat up." He spoke with such genuine warmth that she felt tears starting again. She looked down at her tray, at this mountain of food that would feed her family for a week back home, and something inside her chest broke open like a dam giving way. She thought about her mother in Hamburg. The last letter she had received months ago said that her mother was eating one meal a day, usually just potato soup with no potatoes, just the water they had been boiled in. Her little brothers were stealing food from garbage bins behind restaurants that no longer had any food to throw away. Her father had died in the bombing. And here she sat, a prisoner of war, about to eat a feast that kings would envy. She began to cry and could not stop. The tears ran down her face and dripped onto her tray. Her shoulders shook. The American sergeant looked concerned and asked if she was okay. She could not answer because she did not speak English, but she understood the kindness in his voice. She picked up her fork and began to eat through her tears. The turkey was so tender it fell apart in her mouth. The sweet potatoes tasted like dessert. The ice cream was cold and sweet and melted on her tongue. Every bite made her cry harder because every bite reminded her of how much her family did not have. And with every bite, another piece of her belief in the cause she had served crumbled into dust. She whispered in German, so quietly no one could hear. They were lying about everything. It was all lies. A week after Thanksgiving, Gertrude was assigned to a new work detail. Some of the prisoners were being sent to work on nearby farms because American men were still overseas and the farms needed help bringing in the late harvest. Gertrude and 5 other women were driven in a truck to a farm about 20 miles from the camp. The farmer who met them was an older man with white hair and a weathered face. When he spoke to give them instructions, Gertrude realized with a shock that he was speaking German. He was a German immigrant who had come to America 30 years before the war. The farmer, whose name was Mr. Schmidt, showed them around his property. The farmhouse was 2 stories tall, painted white with green shutters, with a wide porch and rocking chairs. Behind it stood a massive red barn, easily 3 times the size of any barn Gertrude had ever seen in Germany. Mr. Schmidt opened the barn doors, and Gertrude felt her breath catch. Inside sat 3 tractors, huge green machines with wheels taller than she was. Along the walls hung every kind of farm tool imaginable, all modern and well-maintained. In the back of the barn sat a combine harvester, a machine so complex and large that Gertrude could not imagine how it worked. Mr. Schmidt saw her staring and began to explain in German. He told her that his farm was 800 acres. He grew corn and soybeans and wheat. With his machines, he could harvest his entire farm in less than 2 weeks. Back in Germany, a farm this size would require 50 families working all season long with hand tools and horse-drawn plows. Here, one man with machines could do it all. He walked her to a grain silo, a tall silver tower that gleamed in the sun. He opened a hatch at the bottom, and golden corn poured out like a waterfall. "This one silo holds enough grain to feed 1,000 people for a year," he said. "I have 4 silos." Gertrude looked at the silos and the machines and the fat cattle grazing in the fields, and suddenly understood something that made her feel sick to her stomach. Germany had never stood a chance. The war was lost before it even began. It was not lost because of traitors or because the soldiers did not fight hard enough. It was lost because Germany was trying to fight a nation that was simply too big, too rich, too powerful. America could build planes faster than Germany could shoot them down. America could train soldiers faster than Germany could kill them. America could grow food faster than Germany could eat it. The whole Nazi dream of conquering the world was based on a fantasy, a delusion, a complete misunderstanding of reality. That night, back in the barracks, Gertrude told the others what she had seen. Ilse had her own story to share. She had been taken to a town near the camp for a medical checkup at a civilian doctor's office. In the waiting room, an elderly American woman had sat down next to her. The woman had gray hair and kind eyes and wore a simple dress with a small American flag pin on the collar. She reached into her purse and pulled out a handkerchief tied in a bundle. Inside were 3 homemade cookies, oatmeal with raisins. The woman offered one to Ilse and something in English that Ilse did not understand, but the meaning was clear. The woman was sharing her food, giving comfort to a stranger, showing kindness to someone who had been her enemy.
Ilse took the cookie and bit into it. It was sweet and chewy and tasted like it had been made with love. The woman patted her hand and said something else, and though Ilse could not understand the words, she heard the tone. It was the tone a grandmother uses, full of warmth and care. There was no hatred in this woman's eyes, no contempt, no desire for revenge. Just simple human kindness offered to another human being who was far from home. Ilse had sat there holding that cookie and feeling her entire worldview collapse like a building with its foundation removed. She had been taught that Americans were soulless machines who cared only about money. But this woman, whose sons had probably fought in Europe, whose family had probably lost people in the war, was offering cookies to a German prisoner out of pure goodness. The 3 women sat together on their bunks in the dim light. Annalise spoke the truth they were all feeling. "When we go home, we cannot tell them what we saw here. They will not believe us. They will say we are traitors or that we were brainwashed. They will hate us for speaking the truth." Gertrude nodded slowly. "But we will know. We will carry this knowledge inside us for the rest of our lives. We will know that everything we believed was a lie, and the people we hated were the ones who showed us more mercy than our own government ever did." In the spring of 1946, the women finally received their orders to go home. They packed the few belongings they had been allowed to keep and boarded trucks that took them to a train station, then a train that carried them to New York City. When they saw the city for the first time, they could not speak. Buildings rose into the sky like mountains made of steel and glass, taller than anything they had imagined possible. Cars filled the streets in rivers of metal. People walked on sidewalks wearing clean clothes and carrying packages from stores that were actually open and selling things. There was no rubble, no bomb craters, no burned-out buildings. The war had never touched this place. At the harbor, a massive ship waited to take them across the Atlantic Ocean. The women climbed aboard with hundreds of other prisoners, men and women from camps all across America, all going home to a Germany they barely remembered. As the ship pulled away from the dock, Ilse stood at the railing and watched the Statue of Liberty grow smaller in the distance. The green lady with her torch held high, welcoming people to America, the land of plenty. Ilse whispered to herself, "I am leaving the future and going back to the past." Gertrude stood beside her and squeezed her hand. Neither of them said anything else because there were no words big enough to hold what they were feeling. The ocean crossing took 2 weeks. The women spent their time standing on deck watching the gray water or sitting in the cramped quarters below, trying to prepare themselves for what they would find. They had heard rumors. Letters from home had stopped coming months ago. The radio reports said Germany was destroyed, divided into zones controlled by the Americans, British, French, and Russians. Millions of people were homeless. Millions more were dead. The cities were graveyards of broken stone. The women tried to imagine it, but their minds could not make the pictures real. When the ship finally docked at Bremerhaven, the women climbed down the gangway onto German soil for the first time in almost 2 years. The smell hit them first. Smoke and rot and human waste and despair. The dock was crowded with people who looked like ghosts, thin and pale and hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that were more holes than fabric. Buildings along the waterfront were just empty shells with no roofs, their windows like dead eyes staring at nothing. Piles of rubble lined the streets, sometimes 2 stories high. Children sat on the rubble, picking through it with their hands, looking for anything useful, anything to eat, anything to sell. Annalise carried a duffel bag over her shoulder. Inside were things the American soldiers had given her as gifts when they learned she was going home. Chocolate bars, cans of Spam, packages of cigarettes that could be traded for almost anything, bars of soap, a wool blanket, a pair of shoes. The Americans had been so generous, pressing gifts into her hands and wishing her good luck, like they genuinely cared what happened to her even though she had been their enemy. Now she clutched that duffel bag and looked at the ruins of Bremerhaven and felt guilty for having so much when everyone around her had nothing.
The women were processed through a checkpoint where British soldiers checked their papers and asked them questions about where they had been and where they were going. Then they were released to find their own way home. Gertrude took a train toward Bavaria. Ilse headed north toward Hamburg. Annalise traveled east, deeper into the Russian zone where her village waited. They hugged each other goodbye on the platform, these 3 women who had shared the strangest journey of their lives, and promised to write letters even though they all knew the promises were empty. The Germany they were returning to was not a place where letters got delivered reliably. Annalise's train moved slowly through the countryside, stopping and starting, sometimes sitting on the tracks for hours for no reason anyone could explain. Through the window she saw fields that should have been green with spring crops, but instead were brown and empty. Forests with trees blown apart by artillery. Villages that were just foundations and chimneys, everything else burned or bombed away. She saw people walking along the roads with bundles on their backs, refugees going nowhere because there was nowhere to go. The train was so crowded that people stood pressed together in the aisles, silent and swaying with the motion of the car. When she finally reached her village 3 days later, Annalise almost did not recognize it. Half the buildings were gone. The church where she had been baptized was a pile of stones with only one wall still standing. Her family's house was damaged but still there, which made her cry with relief. She walked up the path and knocked on the door.
Her younger brother opened it and stared at her like she was a ghost. He was 14 years old but looked 10, all bones and huge eyes in a thin face. He whispered her name, and she dropped her duffel bag and grabbed him and held him while he cried. Her mother came to the door, and Annalise barely recognized her. The woman who had been strong and healthy when the war started now looked 70 years old, even though she was only 45. Her hair was white, her face was lined with deep wrinkles. Her hands shook. But her eyes lit up when she saw her daughter, and she pulled Annalise inside and held her and wept and thanked God over and over. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with one candle for light because there was no electricity, Annalise opened her duffel bag. She pulled out a Hershey bar and handed it to her brother. He stared at it like it was made of gold. He unwrapped it slowly, carefully, not wanting to tear the paper. Then he bit into it and closed his eyes and made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. He had not tasted chocolate in 5 years. He ate it in tiny bites, making it last as long as possible. And Annalise watched him and remembered the Thanksgiving feast and the Coca-Cola and the endless food at Camp Ruston, and felt a pain in her chest so sharp she thought her heart might break. Her brother asked her, his mouth still full of chocolate, was it terrible, being a prisoner? Annalise looked around the dark kitchen, at the cracked walls and the broken windows covered with boards, and the empty shelves where food should be. She looked at her mother's hollow face and her brother's thin arms. She thought about the mess hall and the industrial kitchen and the farm with 4 grain silos. She thought about the American sergeant who wished her happy Thanksgiving, and the old woman who gave her a cookie. She said quietly, "No. It was not terrible. It was the first time in years I was not afraid of being hungry or cold or dying in a bombing. It was the first time in years I felt safe." Her mother looked at her strangely but said nothing. Some truths were too big and too painful to examine too closely. Gertrude made it back to her village in Bavaria after a week of travel. Her family home was still standing, damaged but repairable. Her mother was alive, though her father had died in the last months of the war. That first night home, after her mother had cried and hugged her and fed her a thin soup made from turnips, Gertrude unpacked her bag. She took out a tin of American coffee, real coffee, and set it on the table. Her mother picked it up and turned it over in her hands like it was a treasure from a fairy tale. Then Gertrude pulled out a photograph that an American guard had taken at the Thanksgiving dinner, showing the decorated mess hall and the tables full of food. She pulled out a letter from the camp dentist who had fixed her tooth, a kind note wishing her well and hoping she found her family safe. Her mother asked the question that everyone would ask. What was America like? Gertrude looked at her mother in the candlelight and chose her words carefully. It was like another world, a world where no one goes hungry, where machines do the work of 100 men, where even enemies are treated with respect and dignity. Her mother shook her head slowly. That is propaganda. They were trying to trick you. Gertrude did not argue. She knew there was no point. Her mother had lived under Nazi propaganda for 12 years, and then under the hardship of defeat. She could not accept that the enemy had been generous and kind, because it would mean that everything she had suffered was for nothing. Years passed. The women built new lives in the ruins of Germany. Ilse married a man who had lost his arm in Russia. They had 3 children and ran a small shop in Hamburg that sold fabric and thread. She never spoke about her time in America except once. Her oldest son, when he was 15 years old in 1960, asked her about the war. She sat him down and told him the truth. "I learned that strength is not the same as cruelty," she said. "I learned that power does not require hate. The Americans were strong because they were free and wealthy, and their nation worked. We were weak because we were fed lies, and our nation was built on hate and fantasy. I spent 2 years as a prisoner in Louisiana, and I was treated better than our own government ever treated us." Annalise never married.
She became a teacher in her village and spent 40 years teaching children to read and think and question what they were told. She kept the photograph from Camp Ruston in a drawer, and sometimes, late at night, she would take it out and look at it and remember. In the 1990s, when she was an old woman with white hair and tired eyes, a young reporter came to interview her for a project about German POWs in America. The reporter asked her what the experience had taught her. Annalise looked out the window, at the rebuilt village, at the cars and the shops, and the people walking around free and healthy and well-fed. She said, "We were taught to believe in blood and soil and racial superiority and the glory of conquest. Then we met the Americans. They were not Superman from propaganda. They were regular people from a country that valued hard work and freedom and taking care of even their enemies. I ate better as a prisoner in Louisiana than I ever ate as a free citizen in Nazi Germany. I was treated with more respect by American guards than I ever received from German officers. When I came home and saw the ruins, I understood the truth. We worshipped power and forgot humanity. The Americans had both power and humanity. That is why they won. The real shock was not how tall or strong they were. The real shock was realizing that everything we believed was a lie, and the people we were taught to hate were the ones who showed us what mercy really means." The reporter asked if she had any regrets. Annalise smiled sadly. "Only one," she said. "I regret that I did not learn these lessons before the war, when learning them might have saved millions of lives." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.